Attachment isn't a style, it's a behavioral system. That system doesn't just shape how you show up in your romantic relationships, it helps shape how you interpret social signals, how you communicate, what you pay attention to, and what becomes easier or harder to remember. Left to its own devices, this attachment system tends to produce patterns that become more entrenched and self-reinforcing over time. And because it's a system that evolved for protection, not truth-seeking, what most of us perceive as reality is at least in part an artifact of our early experiences with physical or emotional threat. Now, let's unpack all this. I'm Andy Christoph and this is Pathbend, where we explore how to reconnect with ourselves, rebuild trust in our relationships, and reclaim our authentic purpose. If you've spent any time on Instagram or YouTube, you've probably run into attachment theory. There's a good chance you already know your attachment style. Maybe you took a quiz, maybe someone forwarded you a carousel with the 10 signs you're, anxiously attached, and you forwarded that to 3 more people. And there's clearly value in this. The 4 styles, secure, anxious, avoidant, and fearful avoidant, have real predictive power. The research behind them is some of the most robust in developmental psychology. But the way they typically get used in pop culture reduces them to dating tropes, shorthand for how you text, how you pull away, how you fall too fast. At worst, they become labels for judging others and yourself. He's secure, she's insecure. He's dismissive, she's anxious. And this tells you a lot about how narrowly we've come to think about this. In this reading, attachment theory is essentially a relationship framework, something we can pull out when things go sideways with the person we're dating. What I'd like to do with this series is look at attachment theory through a different lens, from another angle, as something categorically larger that informs not only how we show up in our closest relationships, but across a variety of social contexts. There's already a ton of related content out there, but by the end of this video, I hope to have convinced you that attachment research deserves a closer look. Not simply because the Instagram edition sweeps the nuance under the rug, but especially because so much of our day-to-day suffering is often rooted in insecure attachment patterns. Originally developed by John Bowlby and expanded by Mary Ainsworth, attachment theory has been the cornerstone for understanding social and emotional development for over 50 years. Bowlby was a psychiatrist, but the big aha moment that propelled the theory didn't come from clinical observation. It came from biology, from ethology, the study of animal behavior in natural habitats. He borrowed in particular from Lorenz and Harlow's work on imprinting in baby geese. Their research had just revealed something profound that upended the assumptions of the time. It showed that proximity to a caregiver wasn't a secondary drive. It's not merely learned behavior that infants adopt because they need food and caregivers provided. It's very much a primary drive, an innately programmed survival system in its own right. In other words, Bowlby realized that in mammals, staying close to a primary protective figure isn't optional. It's what he called a biological imperative, an instinct as fundamental as hunger and thermoregulation. The attachment system actually organizes around 2 competing vectors simultaneously: proximity seeking on one side and exploration on the other. And to explore the world, you need what Ainsworth called a secure base to launch from, and then a safe haven to return to. That's usually the primary attachment figure. Not having had that is at the root of a number of issues surrounding identity formation, boundaries, and other maladaptive patterns, which I'll probably get into in another video. Now let's use an analogy to make this easier to understand. Imagine that each of us comes into this world like a seed, and that seed falls into a particular relational soil. a specific set of caregivers, a specific emotional climate within specific physical conditions. And to survive, the seed must adapt. So it instinctively and quickly starts to make use of whatever nutrients are available around it, and to grow toward whatever light exists in that particular environment. That adaptation is intelligent and efficient. It's how life works. It's what any living system does under constraint. And humans are no different. In our human brains and nervous systems, what those early conditions produce is what Bowlby called internal working models. You can think of these as implicit internal rule books. They're kind of like maps that represent procedural rules about how the world works, how relationships work and whether people can be trusted, what you're worth to others, and how safe it is to need anything from anyone. These internal working models get constructed early, before we have words, and as I mentioned in the integrated brain videos, they're encoded in some of the deepest neural layers. And from there we carry them forward through life. And one of the questions I'd love for you to keep in the back of your mind as this series goes on is, how accurate are those maps at representing the actual conditions or the actual territory that you're living in now? Most conversations around attachment styles tend to cluster around intimacy, our attitude towards it and capacity for it. But I think the research tells a larger story. Even though the attachment system is most directly activated in close relationships, it doesn't only operate inside them. It shapes how you regulate your emotions, what you notice, what you encode in memory, how you communicate, and even what you can and can't consciously think and feel. And the most impressive demonstration of this came from an unexpected place. In the 1980s, Mary Main developed a research method called the adult attachment interview. It's a structured conversation in which the participants are asked to describe their childhood experiences with their parents. The stroke of genius in that study was Main's insight that attachment styles might just be surface-level presentations of the underlying internal models, or states of mind, and that those internal states of mind are revealed in our patterns of speech, which makes them amenable to methodical observation and analysis. That was another eureka moment for attachment theory. What Main and her team discovered was that the way the person told the story, how coherent the narrative was, how easy it was for them to remember the details, the moments of confusion or suddenly going blank, all those details often revealed more about the person's level of attachment security than the facts of the story themselves. In other words, the map shows up in the process of telling, not in what gets told. And here's what's even more profound. The pattern of speech also makes those places of unconscious omission of important information, also called selective exclusion, visible to the researcher, even when the person is oblivious of it. A study from 2022 extends this further. It found that the discourse markers associated with disorganized attachment, aka fearful avoidant, also showed up in ordinary therapy sessions. That included conversations that had little to do with explicit attachment memories or trauma. This actually suggests the possibility that our attachment wiring might be shaping not only how we think and talk about our close relationships, but also how we organize interpersonal communication more broadly. And this is what I meant when I said that the attachment system helps to shape our perception of reality, not just our relationships. The person who believes their perception is accurate might actually be working with an internal model which is selectively biased to exclude certain sensory inputs and distort others. For example, privileging mainly emotional or mainly cognitive information. Let's imagine a simple scenario. 3 people attend the same difficult meeting. A senior leader is critical of the team and outlines a new strategy. And after the meeting, you ask each of them what happened. The anxiously attached person remembers every critical moment, often verbatim. They have almost no recollection of the positive feedback that also came up, and they're probably still metabolizing some of the threat several hours later. The avoidantly attached person gives you an accurate account of the decisions, the action items, the agenda, but they have almost no recollection of the emotional tone of the meeting. Perhaps they register the criticism at a physiological level, but their report stays factual and dry. Finally, the securely attached person gives you something that's closer to what actually happened in the room. They notice the criticism, but also the encouragement. They kept track of the action items, but they can also tell you what felt off and what landed well. In other words, their account captures both some of the emotional texture and has relative factual accuracy. Same meeting, 3 different versions. And the curious thing is that each of them believes their version was an accurate reflection of what happened. With the highly efficient and stable filter, from the inside we're going to believe we're seeing things as they actually are. We're going to think we have an objective, clear read on reality. Even when the filter is consistently biasing our attention and consistently biasing our interpretation across attachment-relevant situations. And because the attachment system works at the level of deep brain structures, you can see its effects beyond intimate relationships. You can hear it in how someone tells a story about their past, in how they respond to a compliment or to a direct question about how they're feeling, or to a moment where suddenly the stakes get high. You don't need anyone to fill out a questionnaire or the Myers-Briggs, but it really helps to be familiar not only with the attachment styles, but the underlying patterns and mechanisms that are driving them. I think that the deeper your understanding of the attachment system, the deeper your understanding of people in general, including the parts of yourself that may have always felt slightly out of reach. And here's something Bowlby noticed and later research in neuroscience and learning theory clarified. These internal maps tend to consolidate with age. Every time we move through the world using a particular pattern, scanning for rejection, withdrawing under threat, suppressing our needs, we're deepening that groove. But there's also an unsettling part to this, which is that the greater the level of attachment insecurity, which is another way of saying that the more there's fragmentation and pockets of relational trauma in our history, the more invested we are in those distorted perceptions and the more rigidly we tend to cling to them. They become the load-bearing beams that stabilize the structure. But they also make it far more difficult to reintegrate some of those excluded inputs. Unfortunately, this compulsive defendedness is also one of the mechanisms that keeps true intimacy out of reach. But it goes deeper than that. We don't just repeat these patterns, we actually wrap our entire identities around them. We build narratives, stories about who we are, how people behave, what the world tends to offer, and what we deserve. And those narratives aren't mere passive descriptions of events. They actively organize our lives and filter what we look for. And it's so curious that we tend to avoid situations that would offer us evidence that's contrary to our internal models. And we actively look for ones that confirm what we already expect. And the subtlety here is that this is not a conscious process. This is a nervous system level reenactment. I guess if you're securely attached, that's really good news because you expect positive things. You've grown up believing that you're okay, other people are safe, and in general, the world is a pretty welcoming place. But if you're deeply insecure, what it implies is that you tend to gravitate towards situations that are harmful to you, that are unhealthy, that are re-traumatizing. I really want this to land viscerally, so let's go back to the seed in the soil. The seed grew into a particular kind of tree, shaped by and for a particular climate. Now imagine the weather conditions change. A warmer season arrives, there's more sunshine, more rain, but the tree doesn't simply change instantly. It doesn't open itself up to the new conditions, because its root structure, its canopy, its tolerance for hot and for cold, for drought, the way it stooped because the wind was blowing from one particular direction, those adaptations evolved for the original climate. And given that the weather is not always constant, this makes total sense. So the tree keeps operating as if the underlying climate remains the same, even as the weather shifts around it from day to day. And that assumption might very well be perfectly adaptive if the warm spell of weather is just a fluke. Or it may be deeply costly in an environment that's truly changed to a new normal. This is why I think the language of secure versus insecure attachment is easy to misread. Think of secure attachment as a resilient all-weather plant. It grew in an environment that was responsive and predictable enough to permit steady growth and flexibility. And so flexibility became part of its structure, part of its strength. It can adapt more easily and bend without breaking when conditions shift. But that doesn't mean it's as well adapted to barren lands and harsh climates as a tree that grew in an extreme environment. An avoidant adaptation is a plant that learned to conserve water in a drought. An anxious adaptation learned to reach aggressively for light in a dim environment, where sunlight only came through sporadically. And the fearful avoidant adaptation is a plant whose soil delivered both water and toxins through the same root. And this made the development of a consistent strategy impossible, because reaching for what's needed most and retreating from it were equally necessary and equally dangerous. So insecure attachment styles aren't failures of development. We can understand them as self-protective strategies shaped by harsh, inconsistent, or unpredictable relational environments, all designed to adapt to the climate they evolved in. The risk and the cost is that they can become maladaptive or inflexible when the conditions change. And I'm pretty sure you can appreciate that the more extreme the original adaptation, the more difficult it would be for that plant to then get comfortable in this rain and shine, kind of neutral, balmy situation. By default, the tree's gonna grow more or less in the shape it already has. Similarly, left unexamined, insecure patterns persist unless you actively give them corrective relational experiences and do deep intentional work. As hard as it sometimes is for us to admit certain things to ourselves, awareness is the non-negotiable starting point. Because you can't steer a system that you can't even see. What attachment theory implies, especially if we're insecurely attached, is that the internal maps we're navigating the world with might be designed for a different environment than the one we're currently living in. And we probably have blind spots around that, believing that this is simply how things are, and pointing to others or to our circumstances as the source of our interpersonal distress. If you think back to the videos on the brain and nervous system, I hope you can start appreciating how these deep structures, these deep adaptations that we're not conscious of, are actually driving our lives. One of the reasons I started working on this series is that I went looking for a specific answer. I wanted to understand where these internal working models are actually located in the brain and nervous system. Which neural circuits, which neurotransmitters, which structures are involved. And I thought I'd get a quick and easy answer because this theory is very old. It's like over 70 years old. It's super well supported behaviorally, and it has produced some of the most extraordinary, most replicable findings in developmental psychology. So I thought we probably know everything about the kind of neural substrate of this by now. But we actually don't. Many researchers are just starting to delve deeper into these questions themselves. And I'm not implying by any means that that attachment theory is weak. The predictive power we discussed across relationships, memory, communication, physiological response, that's not even in question. What hasn't been settled are the mechanisms underneath, the specific neural architecture that produces these patterns, and the computational processes by which these threat environments in infancy become a filter on reality in adulthood. And as I got more and more curious about that, I had a moment that reframed the entire series for me. If the mechanism is still not fully understood, what does that tell us about the four labels themselves? Secure, anxious, avoidant, fearful, avoidant. The four buckets might be the best available shorthand we have for a set of continuous dynamic threat prediction processes that are more granular and perhaps more fluid than the four-way taxonomy can capture. So as you look at the 2x2s on Instagram, this is the distinction I'd love for you to carry out of this video. Attachment theory, as powerful as it is just that, a theory. It's like the weather report. It simplifies in order to illuminate. When you meet someone and think she's avoidant or he's anxious, you're doing something useful and you're getting, insight into how they might react, how they might behave. That's probably going to be right more often than not. But you're also compressing something really complex and developmentally rich into this kind of flat 2x2. The curious thing is that the most sophisticated researchers in the field have moved toward models that are more dynamic, more continuous, and more context aware. This is something I'd love to explore as part of this series. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about this video or any future topics you may be interested in. Thanks so much for being here. Take good care of yourselves and see you next time.